floor is yours. We are all really looking forward to hearing to your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And also thanks for having me and kind of starting your day and ending mine with uncertainty, anxiety, and hope. I guess that's how we kind of start and end many of our days these days. Let me just get my screen sharing going. Just have to make sure I can do share computer center. Okay, great. Can everybody see? Can I get a thumbs up from someone if you can see my screen? Okay, great. Okay. So again, I'm Bill Finnegan. I based at the University of Oxford. I'm very close to finishing up a PhD, fingers crossed, and also part of some emerging climate education activities at the university. So there's a new interdisciplinary hub that's bringing together people from across the sciences and humanities to talk about what climate education is and could be. And one theme, again, that I've been looking at is how young people are engaging with the future. So in this presentation, about a half hour, kind of the rough structure is a little bit more background about me and my research, and then two particular research projects that are kind of getting at these themes from kind of slightly different perspectives, different methods as well. And then plenty of time to talk and discuss. And also at any point, feel free to jump in with questions or stop me. I'm gonna get, if I can get the chat up too, just so I can see it in case anything comes in there. So about me, I have been in the UK for 10 years. I'm American. My accent's kind of drifting, so sometimes I feel like I have to explain all of this geography. I've been working in environmental communication, digital communication for environmental organizations for many years. And that's actually how I crossed paths with Alan through work for the Global Environmental Education Partnership and the North American Association for Environmental Education. But I started this PhD in 2019, 3 years ago. And was kind of coming at it, basically it was one of those, it's my kind of nerdy midlife crisis. I was like reading the IPCC 1.5 degrees report and thinking, we are entering this decade of consequence. What am I doing? And part of the one hat I was wearing was as a communicator, storyteller, working in digital communications. Another hat that I was wearing was as someone who like had questions about if that was working and wanting to kind of pursue that in more of a structured way, like through research. But then a third hat was as a parent. And so I have 3 school-age children in the English school system. And this pictures from when during COVID lockdown in our village in Buckinghamshire, kind of Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire border. They did front steps portraits of all the different, or whoever wanted to, 100 different families in the village. Anyhow, for a lot of this, I'm thinking of what's the world my children are growing up in. Kind of, I can't really turn that off in my head. So that's there. I don't know, do people in Australia have pet snakes? I don't know, you have snakes, but anyhow, the pet snake is still with us. I'm afraid the pet avocado, it's no one with us. Another important piece of context, 2019 in the UK was like all go. You know, there's the school climate strikes, there's Extinction Rebellion. David Attenborough was finally being a very strong, prominent voice around climate change. In Parliament, maybe not through government leadership, but at least through the inability to resist. There was the declaration of a climate emergency in the UK Parliament. There was the update of the Climate Change Act to enshrine net zero by 2050 in law. So there was just a lot going on. And a lot of it also had to do with schools being the front line of this because of the school climate strikes. This is a picture from the Oxford climate strikes, which were pretty active. And so in 2019, that was really all coming to a head. So as I started the PhD project, I was kind of thinking, well, how are schools reacting? So there's I wanted to do a little bit of like what I've been thinking about for the past 3 years, but I didn't want it to be this rabbit hole we all fall down into. So I thought I'd write it down on a napkin and try, it's like Twitter, kind of the kind of constraint. Fortunately, I have some bad handwriting, but anyhow, so the kind of overall thing I was looking at, how are schools responding to the climate crisis? Secondary schools in the United Kingdom, that kind of became the big question. But as it broke down, you know, one piece that it was mentioned in the introduction, I'm interested in social practices. So I was with 12 different secondary schools in the UK, in kind of Greater London and Thames Valley region. I was going and speaking to different stakeholders, people with different roles in the school, and exploring what sustainability meant to them, and trying to look at it not just in terms of kind of individual choices, behaviors, but these more patterns of activities in the school. So there's a bit of kind of whole school sustainability there, but also practices, practice architectures, and elements of social practice. A shorthand I've used is stuff, skills, and story. But as I was talking to young people and parents and teachers, it just really felt like there was something else going on in terms of how this latest wave of youth climate activism, youth environmental activism is engaging with these issues and engaging with the future. So kind of future became a new theme, and, you know, kind of how we emotionally engage with the future brings up issues of anxiety and distress. Kind of how we feel and think about the future brings up questions of hope. How we engage with future environmental issues. Some people would call that kind of action competence, but there's other ways of thinking about that, kind of literacies and competencies. But then another piece is you're projecting into the future. You're harnessing your imagination. You're speculating, and that got me interested in kind of storytelling and imaginaries and socio-technical imaginaries. And so there's a few of these different themes that kind of became part of this research project. And another piece, and this was also kind of mentioned in the introduction, is that question of kind of holding the space between kind of disengagement and despair. And it's something that I feel like you kind of see if you're kind of looking at kind of the discourses of climate, but also people for a long time keeping it at arm's length. You know, they're kind of different. There's outright denial, but there's also small acts of kind of distancing and disavowal, and you kind of, that might get expressed as the shrug, like, what's the big deal? And then there can be, when you kind of look at it closely, deeply, engage with it fully, you get to this space of like, oh man, like this is really bad. And that can be translate to what some, you know, a lot of people talk about doomerism, fatalism, climate anxiety, climate distress, the idea that it's too late to do anything about it. And so that feels like a really important question, I think, for educators, for researchers, for communicators, for storytellers, for parents, for human beings on the planet at this time. Like, how do you hold that space between disengagement and despair? Which could, you know, a term like hope could be used as the space, solutions are in that space. So that's kind of in the back of my head, something I've wondered about. So to turn to the first, the first article. So I think in the email that went out, there kind of might have been some links for this. This is open access in environmental education research. So you can even just go to the EER website and go through the recent open access articles, and it's not too hard to find. And in that spirit of open, it's also, there's a link through that you can find the actual, you know, questionnaire and data and Jupyter notebook I used for analysis. That's all on the Oxford Research Archive. So that's all out there for what it's worth. So this project, it kind of, as I was like looking at these themes about the future, I was also curious about like, well, how can we really make sense of how young people are engaging with the future? Can we kind of maybe even like triangulate a few different things, measures of hope, measures of distress, ratings of future scenarios? Again, this idea of action competence being kind of a future orientated approach to sustainability and action. And so that was the goal, was to just try and explore that a little bit more, and then also to fit that in within kind of the school system, the education system, the journey that young people go on. So kind of teacher practices on one side, potential outcomes of education on the other. How does this kind of engagement with the future, whether it's kind of under the banner of hope or distress, how does that mediate that process from teacher practices to student outcomes? And so this was a questionnaire. This is another piece of this, is that this was really like a COVID pivot. So I was at this point early in my PhD research when the school lockdowns happened, and I had already started building relationships with schools for the social practices piece I mentioned. I was doing lots of interviews, but interviews through Zoom. And I also was doing digital storytelling workshops. I'll talk more about that in a second. And for the storytelling workshops, I thought it might be nice to capture some structured information from the young people in these workshops, maybe even as a bit of pre and post test. So I put together a questionnaire on these themes. And then I realized with the schools that I was already developing relationships with, it made sense to actually distribute that questionnaire more widely. But so the kind of table I have up, you can kind of see the breakdown by the type of school, and also, students identifying as female or students identifying as male. And I think the type of school, both of these actually are related to the schools I was talking to, in the sense that those 12 schools where I was doing these interviews, half of them were independent schools, privately funded schools, and half of them were state schools. And that's not representative of the overall school system in England. So it over-representative of independent schools, although independent schools do have quite a lot of influence. If you think about prime minister and previous prime ministers and cabinet members, there's definitely kind of a social issue in terms of how independent schools do have that influence. So anyhow, it worked out that it was roughly 50-50 for participants in those two. Again, not fully representative, but allows for comparisons. And then in terms of students identifying as female, it's a little bit harder to tell through this breakdown, but it's because also it's ages, but it was roughly 2/3. And that in part was because 3 of the schools I was engaging with were all girls schools. But I think there's also maybe some other things to explore around the makeup of the kind of youth climate movement, and also kind of participation in things like this in a school setting. So then the questionnaire itself, I kind of mentioned I was kind of pulling together these other things. So it was mostly drawn from kind of previously developed, tested, and validated survey instruments from other research. And then with kind of a few other pieces I added in, but was really an attempt to kind of to see what the relationships between some of these different scales might be. And then also in kind of a small way to look to try to replicate a bit of it. So especially the last bullet there, Maria Oyala's work around climate change and hope, constructive hope with Swedish teenagers and teacher practices. So that kind of comes in. I'll come back to that in a minute. And so then just to kind of explore one of these pieces, there's a future scenario piece. So this came from some research in Germany, where there is on environmental and sustainability education, and there are actually 6 different scenarios in the and actually I included in the questionnaire, but only the climate related ones in this article. But the other scenarios were around social inequity and kind of robotics, artificial intelligence. Anyhow, the climate scenarios, the idea was with these scenarios, you projected 50 years in advance and read the scenario and then rate it for how desirable that scenario is and how likely you think it is to be the case 50 years from now. So I actually thought we could just do a little bit, how many people can I see at once? I thought we could do a bit of a test of this. So read through these, that we can pretty much throw out the desirability rating, because that's just a sense check to make sure the positive scenario is positive, the negative scenario is negative. But the likelihood is kind of the interesting piece. So the first scenario, I'm just curious, there's a Likert scale 1 to 7. Sure, if people could hold up fingers of how you would rate that first scenario, as how likely on a scale from 1 to 7 on the fly. Any fingers going up? Seeing a 4. So I'm having to look around. 5, 5, 3. Okay, bit of a range there. And then the second scenario, clearly the negative scenario, same idea, kind of holding up fingers on a scale of 1 to 7. So 4 in the middle.
Sorry, Bill, the question is how desirable or how likely?
How likely. So again,
Okay,
I think
okay,
the
okay.
desirability, we can kind of take for granted that people would find the first one pretty desirable and the second one pretty undesirable. So if we just skip to the likelihood of the second scenario, anybody want to hold? Sorry, how many? I see 3 fingers, 5 fingers, 5, 4, 4. Okay, just it's a bit of a sense check. So anyhow, this is just to bring in kind of the student and the teacher ratings in this. Also, yeah, there's a number of teachers involved in this as well. Smaller number because of just kind of the ratio in each of these schools. So, you know, there's questions around what does it mean to be optimistic or pessimistic about the future. And I even kind of am reluctant to use those words. I tend to just stick to talking about kind of being somewhat positive or somewhat negative about your outlook. But it became pretty clear that both students and teachers thought that the negative scenario was more likely than the positive scenario. And so that is, again, a bit of a kind of just a check of kind of like what's that future outlook look like for them, roughly, kind of with this kind of projection of a scenario. Another piece, so just a bit of a sidebar on hope. There's a theory of hope. Hope theories kind of influence things like that climate change hope scale, and also Maria Ayala's work. And so there's three components to hope in this kind of articulation of it. There's a goal. So you need to want something. There's a path. So there's a way to get that goal. It can't be an impossible goal. It can't be, I hope to fly away. It has to be something that is within the realm of possibility, but probably something that's not something you can take for granted, because there's not very much point of hoping for that either. So there's a goal, there's a way to get to it, and then there's a will. So sometimes it's articulated as like way power and willpower. And so in this piece of hope and action competence, I was kind of struck by how in some of the research these things were articulated. So for the climate change hope scale from Leon Monroe, the way they broke it down, kind of the subscale pieces were personal sphere, will and way. So again, that's that kind of the path and the willingness to walk it. Collective sphere, which is, if I'm hoping for a better job, that's my own journey. But if I'm hoping for like not climate catastrophe, that's a journey we're all on together. So there's a collective element of it. And then lack of will and way was just kind of a little bit of a kind of survey methods thing they did. So just to get up a definition of action competence, then in some kind of European circles, this has been circulating as kind of somewhat related to literacies, competencies around environmental issues, but it's around future environmental problems. So it's not just a measure of pro-environmental behaviors. So it's not, you know how to recycle, or you know how to do whatever it is. It's you have some sort of process for engaging with whatever that future environmental problem is. And the way that some of the researchers recently did it, so again, the two scales, CCHS is climate change hope scale. The one below that is self-perceived action competence for sustainability questionnaire. And they broke it down to these components of knowledge of action possibilities. That feels very much like way power. Confidence in own influence, a bit of self-efficacy there, and then willingness to act, kind of willpower in the hope model. So it felt like there were like parallels between these things, even though they weren't necessarily in the literature kind of necessarily directly talking to each other. So with having these kind of already established, developed, validated scales in the same questionnaire, I was able to kind of compare, well, how do they rate? And there's a pretty strong relationship there. So kind of in terms of that kind of Pearson correlation, but you can see it, the kind of linear relationship and the clumping there. And this was an even stronger relationship if you just look at that personal will and way, because of that subscale of hope with the action competence measurement. So it feels like there might be something there in terms of action competence being a way of understanding what that personal element of hope is. At the same time, I don't know if this is like a bit of inside baseball. So like the metaphor there is like, it's used in politics sometimes, but like, some people just like to watch sports. Other people like know every player's, like batting average, on base percentage, when they were last traded. Like they kind of have this like really like in it mindset. In politics, like inside the Beltway, you kind of talk about like people care about different things if they're like in the thick of politics. I don't know if this is just interesting to me because I'm like reading articles about this and no one else seems to be connecting the dots. Is it an inside baseball question for sustainability education, or is there some broader applicability of it? I leave that to other people to decide. So the next thing, kind of continuing on themes of hope and other, hopeful being emotion, hope being a cognitive process, and there's kind of stuff wrapped up in there. But something that came out of the work I was doing with the digital storytelling project was in this museum in Oxford where they had hosted other events with young people around climate change, and they had printed out all these cards with different emotions on them, and they had used it as an icebreaker. And so you would go and pick 3 cards that reflect how you feel about climate or the future or something like that, and then you would talk about it. And I just thought this was actually a really interesting way of, there's kind of bit of simplicity, bit of complexity to it, and also as an open-ended question in the survey, I was curious what it would elicit. And so was just included this: how do you feel about the future? Please use only 3 words. And with a bit of cleanup and kind of combining of related words, the kind of the young people involved in this came up with these are like 33 words that were mentioned at least 5 times, kind of a range of different responses to the future, kind of emotional responses, you can think of it. How do you feel about the future? So another bit of interactive, this will be in the chat. So if you can, basically the idea was, if you see a word that resonates as you think about climate change in the future, or a future shaped by climate change and our collective response to it. Again, there's different ways of it. In the survey, it just said, how do you feel about the future? But also that came after a series of questions around future scenarios and climate change. I'm curious, in this group, what kind of 3 words you would come up with. So please take a second. Again, if another word comes up, type that. It doesn't have to be one of these words. But maybe type in the chat your kind of comma separated list of words that reflect how you feel about the future. Give people a minute to think about that. Great. I mean, thanks everyone for bringing these in. It's interesting, someone was also talking about kind of intergenerational communication. I think, Jason, it was maybe before we started, because I do think there's also something around how adults, educators, education researchers, how they engage with some of these issues. There's parallels with young people, but there's also something sometimes different going on in our own heads and our own hearts that we kind of need to be aware of as we talk about it. So anyhow, this is what came out of that little exercise with the young people. Because, with the words, I coded them based on what felt like kind of positive, negative, or neutral. And then this diagram is not exactly to scale, but it kind of shows the relationships, relative repetition, but also relationships between. And so hopeful was the word that was most frequently mentioned. But then if you look in the kind of top 5, we've also got scared and worried and uncertain. So kind of 2 negative and neutral, and then excited. So there's this like mix of things going on. And I think another piece that I found really interesting, so in kind of network diagrams, you've got your nodes, the circles, and then you've got your edges, which is the relationships between them. And so a purple line is an edge between positive feeling and a negative feeling. So they co-occurred. So in someone's list, they were both hopeful and worried, or hopeful and scared. And I think sometimes we, in kind of the popular presentation of, say, something like climate anxiety, hope is presented as the antidote to anxiety. But hope and anxiety are kind of coexisting to some extent. And this is all kind of swirling around, and again, in young people and in the adults in their lives, if they're engaged with these issues sometimes. So in terms of practical things, very practical things, this was the kind of replication of the Oyala paper around teacher practices. And so she came up with a series of teacher practices. I think it's a really interesting future research project, is working with educators to come up with other what are kind of emerging teacher practices around climate education. But in that previous study, it was, are you kind of positive in the classroom or negative? Are you accepting of negative emotions or dismissive? So kind of a future outlook in the classroom, and their sustainable development pathways. And that of those, the ones that had the strongest correlation with student-reported hope. So, and it was both in Maria Oyala's study and in this questionnaire I did in the UK, it was accepting negative emotions, excuse me, and maintaining a positive and solution-oriented outlook in the classroom. I think those are relatively intuitive for people who are engaging with this, but I think it's also just a really great reminder that that's something any educator can do. If you're engaging with climate change, you need to keep that in front of mind. And I also think you need to think of both of them at the same time, because you could think that being positive means kind of brushing away anything negative. And actually, it's really important to create the space to engage with whatever emotions are coming up, while also framing kind of solutions and a potential positive future. And then this is, I don't want to get too bogged down by the details, especially since I'm getting close to that half hour. But this is the last piece I mentioned. So I'm going to have a sip of my tea. My throat's going weird. Which is kind of bringing it all together. So teacher practices on one side, student outcomes on the other. In this case, it was looking at participation in school sustainability activities, like an eco club or an environmental protest, like Fridays for Future. And then the teacher practice on the left is just that positive outlook, because it was the one that had the strongest relationship with the things on the right. And then thinking of these kind of emotional cognitive responses from young people as the mediators. So climate change hope as a mediator and climate change distress as a mediator. But this is very kind of exploratory snapshot of what is a really complicated thing to tease out. But I think there's something to this around, and maybe a kind of potential future research that could be more experimental or longitudinal, but that in the top, and again, I don't want to get bogged down by the kind of regression analysis, but basically, as you add in these mediators, the model feels more robust in terms of what it can explain, but it also attributes some of the relationship to those mediators. And so in the top one, the climate change hope was a bigger factor in school sustainability activity, and in the excuse me, the bottom one, climate change distress, was a bigger factor in protest activity. Again, somewhat intuitive potentially in terms of what gets people out on the streets versus what gets people volunteering to do something in their school. But it also, I think, shows that there's this, again, complicated relationship between hope, distress, agency, and action that to me feels like a really ripe thing for educators, education researchers to be exploring. So we're at half past. And that's the end of the first paper. So I don't have as much time to get into this, but I think I can kind of give you a sense of this other piece of my research. And it's the digital storytelling component. And digital storytelling is a tradition coming from community arts in California. If you're curious, the Story Center has done a lot of work on this over the years. And it's played out in terms of being used in research and evaluation, but also in development projects, in healthcare, and some environmental initiatives as well. And generally, a digital storytelling process, it's facilitated. So you're involved in a workshop, and you're really, you're there to tell your story, whatever it might be. And there might be kind of a theme around it that kind of brings people in the room. But the people facilitating the workshop help you kind of identify a story you want to tell, a kind of particular moment. So it's a very reflective process, very first person. And then you craft that into kind of a short, maybe 2 to 3 minute story narrated by your voice. And then you bring in some sort of visuals or music, whatever it might be, to turn it into a short video. And so it's in some ways a really kind of rough format. We're very used to very kind of polished multimedia things. And this is very rough, but also very authentic, kind of very, again, first person. And in terms of, as a research method, it's a means of involving your research participants in that process of telling their own story and kind of shaping what they want to share. And the difference in this project was that I was looking at a kind of speculative digital storytelling. So instead of reflecting back, we projected to the future. And I feel like I've already said too much. Normally, I feel like when I talk about storytelling, I should just play a story. So I have a short video. This will be a test if my audio is working in. So it's one of these about 50 videos, digital stories that came out of working with young people in the UK and Ireland. And it'll give you kind of a sense of the shape these took.
Dear 2021 Lucy, it does get better, I promise. I know that the constant reminder of the world beginning to end in 2030 is both worrying and frustrating, but it will improve. It's currently 2050, and after years of neglecting the planet, we have reached an ideal life, where we live in nature without damaging it. It's beautiful, living without fear that the world will end soon. We can do things without feeling guilt or regret because it has all worked out. It hasn't always been this easy. For years on end, the government prioritised businesses and capitalism. The focus of the world was to make more money because people thought that when the world ended we would just be able to pay it off. The global temperature and the carbon in the atmosphere rose at alarming rates, but after an incredible amount of protests and education, the world took us seriously. Study was put into renewable energy sources, meat and dairy alternatives, and materials to replace plastic. It seems so simple in the first place. It shouldn't have taken so long to get here. We lost many species to extinction along the way. The polar bear, the snow leopard, the green sea turtle, and so many more that we could have saved, but we're here now. I can drive to other towns without polluting the atmosphere, and I can even eat vegan cheese without being unsatisfied. We managed to get to a place that I thought was unachievable. The sky isn't as pretty as it used to be. I miss the sun shining all day and the beautiful colours you would see as it set. We never see a blue sky now, it's always an orange colour, and we have to wear masks out, very much like you had to during the first virus. The atmosphere is still not clean, but technology has allowed us and other living things to adapt to the new climate. We take vitamins to replace the sun, and we grow plants in buildings with fluorescent lights. It's not what I hoped for at your age, but we're all lucky to be alive. Keep working hard for the future, because it pays off. From 2050, Lucy.
Hopefully you heard that okay. So the, each of these stories kind of paints a richer picture than you might get from filling in the questionnaire. So it's kind of a very different process, and also maybe a kind of a bit more complicated, a bit more nuanced view of the future. So the kind of questions for this, part of my research was to try to go deeper, kind of tease out a bit more of how young people were imagining the future. And this was a bit more of a time investment, a bit more self-selecting. So they tended to be young people who are already engaged with climate change and climate activism. And then a piece of this, which is also, this is to some extent a research method, to some extent it's also an environmental education intervention. And so, to what extent does creatively engaging with the future, what does that have, what impact does that have on young people? So those are two kind of guiding questions. And then, the digital stories became the data, a major piece of the data. So, the narration for each of those, and then also kind of notes around the use of visuals and music and other things. And there were kind of two components to that analysis. There's the kind of reflexive thematic analysis, just kind of teasing out what different things were mentioned, different things were represented, but then also looking at the narratives as a whole. So instead of just coding a little bit of the script or kind of a use of visuals, to kind of think, well, what's the overall story, kind of sweep of narrative that the young people used? And I find that to be kind of a really interesting piece of it, in the sense that, even things that, like in Lucy's story just then, I feel like it's going into kind of a relatively positive, rosy picture. And then as you get into it, you realize, well, actually, there's a sense of loss. There's a sense of kind of living with change. And so there's more to kind of tease out and explore, in addition to what kind of you might have thought of kind of the straight up utopia or dystopia type narratives. So anyhow, those are kind of the themes that came out of it. From that first piece. But then for the second piece, is this question of impact. And there's a lot of words on the screen, and depending on how big your screen is, you might be able to read it. But basically, this is a transcript from focus group. So with the workshop, it tended to be in person. It was 2 days. So I did it at a museum, I did it at a few schools, but a lot of it I was also doing through Zoom. And that would be kind of a series of maybe 2-hour sessions. So like 3-week, consecutive weekly 2-hour sessions. And in that last session, they would present their videos and we would talk about them. So it's like a little mini film festival celebrating their success and kind of what they had developed in terms of skills with other other young people going through the same process. And then we again talked about it, and this is essentially the focus group conversation in that conversation, in that kind of moment. And I mean, I really loved this. This was 4 students from one school who were part of this process, each of them kind of reflecting on kind of where they saw themselves going in that journey as they were engaging with the future creatively. And again, it's a lot of words so whatever you're able to digest, but you even should kind of get the beginning of each of these statements, you're getting a sense they're each kind of coming at this slightly differently. But I'd say kind of what I feel like is a theme through it is positive reappraisal. And so this brings me to Oyala's model of hope, again, slightly different than Monroe and Lee and Monroe's, which it's kind of trust in one's ability. Again, that's kind of a personal will and way, but the kind of trust component. So maybe again, there's kind of a bit of self-efficacy, agency, trust in others. So again, that collective component, and then positive reappraisal. And that kind of goes back, appraisal and reappraisal goes back in kind of psychology literature to kind of ideas of stress and coping with stress. And this shorthand, I think, of positive reappraisal is essentially that you kind of, what was seen as initially a problem, you engage with it in a way that you can trigger something in yourself that either kind of sees alternatives or solutions, or something else rises in yourself to engage, or you kind of, again, with these young people, some were saying, I see the possibilities I can do now. Others were saying, I want to live without regret. These are kind of ways of finding positive reappraisal for what you have control over, what you can do in your life in response to this. And so again, there's kind of how you kind of reappraise things in a positive way. And there's another kind of question for other research. Some of this is coming from kind of terminal illness, studies of war, natural disasters. Like, are there this kind of interest in how we manage climate anxiety, how we kind of foster climate hope? Where else can we see kind of models for that in other fields, other periods in history, other social movements, maybe? But I do think that feels like the promise of that digital storytelling process, is that sense of tapping into some sort of positive reappraisal, and also doing it with others, because I think, again, it was a shared experience, so maybe it builds that trust with others. So that I just have the last video was kind of a combination of lots of voices that we put together from it. So we can either Jason, if you have thoughts on this, we could go straight to the discussion, maybe save this for the end, or I could play this. I think it's about 2.5 minutes long.
No, play it, Billy, and then we can go to the discussion.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll go ahead and play this.
Hey, it's you. Or me, same thing.
This might confuse you, but I'm you from the future.
I'm writing this from 2050. Things have changed so quickly.
I look back on the time you are living in with fondness.
The world today is different from the one you once feared, that filled you with hopelessness and frustration.
Should I tell you what the world will be like 30 years from now? Well, it can go in 2 ways.
Politicians did nothing to stop climate change. It was too little, too late.
The world is ablaze.
I'm talking about droughts and floods.
Numbers of climate refugees reached an all-time high this year.
I should be dead. I couldn't tell you how I made it to an underground bunker.
I'm hiding in my basement. I stayed at home for as long as I could, but we still ran out of food.
Nature can now only be found in history books and VR headsets.
You're shocked. You knew the way everyone treated this planet was bad, but you never thought it'd be this bad, did you? Did you? Did you? Did you?
Or it can go the second way.
The change that needed to happen did, slowly but surely, come about.
We are in what people have taken to calling the healing, a period of repair, of restoration, of rebuilding.
You started to drive electric cars.
plastic-free shops became the norm.
Sustainable agriculture, lab-grown meat, solar farms, forest restoration.
It's beautiful, living without fear that the world will end soon.
It is up to you how much light there will be in the dark and what remains as an anchor of positivity, hope, and joy.
These next few months will decide the outcomes for generations to come.
Use your voice to be as loud as you can.
Our voices are louder together.
Make sure to look after yourself, love yourself, and keep making changes, no matter how small.
I'll leave you there, but keep your eyes open. Take care.
Great. So thanks, everybody. That's all I had in terms of presentation, but still got plenty of time for any questions or discussion. So
thanks, Bill. Thank you very much. So let's start our conversation, and anybody who wants to start, just if you want to unmute and just speak, that's fine. Well, I will start, Bill, to break the silence. So I have a question for you that, I mean, it's a difficult question, but just to have your thoughts about it. But I was thinking of the two videos that you showed, and they're really, at least for me, very emotional, and they touched my emotions in many ways. And something this year I've been teaching a course on sustainability to future teachers, to these young people that will become teachers, and something that I found very, very difficult to manage or to kind of negotiate was this, precisely the emotions of the students. No, because on the one hand, I was really impressed by how many of them were very, very unaware of many of the issues related to sustainability or to climate change. I mean, yeah, they knew a little bit, but how little they knew. Others, of course, were more engaged. So I was always navigating between these two sides of like shocking them and showing them, making them react. Like this is like showing them the kind of videos that or images that will make them react. But on the other hand, I had this feeling that sometimes the classes ended with like a very grim situation where it was very depressing. So how do you move from one side to the other? I know it's not in your research to tell us what to do, but what are your thoughts on these two issues of like making people react, but on the other hand, keeping things more emotionally under control, so to speak?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, and teachers who are across different subjects who are interested in climate change or maybe want to do more climate change education, but feel hesitancy, I feel like that kind of emotional dimension is one big piece of it. Sometimes it's kind of hesitancy around the politics of the issue. Sometimes it's hesitancy around that sense of are they an expert in it, or do they have the resources to do it properly? But then I do think that emotional dimension is like, what are they opening up, and what is the kind of, from a well-being or safeguarding perspective, what is the impact on their students? I mean, what I take from that kind of, again, that kind of survey question, again, the kind of from the research in Sweden that are replicated in the UK, that kind of idea of being accepting of negative emotions means creating the space for them to be expressed, and I don't know, creating what feels like a safe environment for that, but then holding it in a way that it, that you can, I don't know, not let that overwhelm or kind of disrupt what you actually, the broader message you want, which again is maintaining that positive outlook or kind of being able to talk about solutions. But I think there's a big question around, like, we're talking about climate change always with the science and the problem and the impact, and then at the end we get to the solutions, and sometimes there's a mismatch between the scale of the problem and the scale of the solutions that we're actually talking about. And I think young people are very savvy to that disconnect. And I mean, another, again, just general reflection is that, like, educators have often or continues in some cases to approach this as like an information deficit, kind of knowledge gap issue. And I think that whole kind of disengaged to screen, despair thing, a lot of it is that young people, this generation, they have heard about climate change from when they were in primary school. They've been talking, this has been hanging over their entire lives. And so they don't need more of this, that, the more they get bombarded by the situation, whether it's in the classroom or through news media or through social media, the more they get pushed to that kind of doom and fatalism, if there isn't an outlet for action, whether that's in the school or beyond. Again, so that doesn't quite answer your question, but it's the same. No, we're definitely thinking about similar things.
Thanks, Phil.
Lucas, I see you have a hand up.
Yeah, Lucas, please. Sorry.
Thanks, Bill. Really great research, mate. So two things. I'm just thinking about two things. One is that if I'm a youth researcher, and in our research, we see that politics and one's feeling of capacity to influence remains highly localized. And even in our research with, for example, social entrepreneurs who had very, very large scale plans, the way that they constructed and thought about it was far more localized. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. They just see that they can influence things in their own lives and things in their local communities and have trouble going to that scale that you just mentioned. So that's part one, but I'll go to part two. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts about whether you see that in your own research and how we kind of shift thinking to the global.
Yeah, and I think that's also shifting from the individual to the system, and from kind of small acts of consumerism to large acts of politics. So there's like parallels there. This is more in the other piece of research I didn't really talk about, but when I was doing kind of focus groups with young people in school and talking about climate sustainability, again, often it was talking about single-use plastic. That's kind of the extent of the conversation. Maybe a bit of waste recycling, maybe a bit of kind of food in the canteen and food waste, and not kind of large-scale social change or political change. And there's questions of that's 16 to 18-year-olds in the UK can't vote, so they're not seen as a kind of political force necessarily. So there's some limitations to kind of that kind of natural scaling up, which I guess the rest of us have that outlet of voting however many years, or being engaged in politics more actively. But I think again, that's where the kind of climate strikes felt like this moment where they'd given up on what was happening in the classroom and in their schools and had gone out in the streets, because they were seeking something bigger. But that is also emerging, so new in terms of the research on the climate strikes and what kind of really motivated the young people who went out.
Yeah, well, I'd add to that classrooms, by their very structure, actually inculcate that distance from a very early stage. They're learning how to be precisely the citizens that are getting us into this situation. They're not adopting it because they're taken to the streets, but yeah, the problem starts with the very way that classrooms and curricula are structured. I've got a second one, but I don't want to hog time. If anyone else wants to ask something, I'll come back. But
go ahead, Lucas.
Yeah, well, so I just wanted to know that Stephen Threadgold, who's a colleague of ours in Australia, did some really interesting research about attitudes to climate change, and I cannot remember the phrase he used, and it was a really nifty, nice phrase, but it was about how the people that he interviewed, the young people he interviewed, would hold these simultaneous thoughts. So there would be despair and an absolutely quite acute understanding of what's up ahead in terms of climate change. But then, almost as a psychological response would, and I know other colleagues in this room right now would probably have more about this, but sort of contained it and separated it. So they had two parallel sets of thinking going on at the same time. There's one where you just plan and get on with your life, while there's this awareness of this other thing that seems very, very large and very present. And I'm wondering if you came across that sort of thing in your work.
Yes, I mean, yes, to some extent. And I think for that, like 16 to 18-year-olds, they're kind of taking their exams, qualifying exams. They're like looking at university, they're looking at career fairs. So there's this strange thing. They're engaging with this future, which is very much based on the past. And I think for some of them, they're very aware that those opportunities, that reality might not even exist as they enter into adulthood. And so there's this weird disconnect. I mean, another thing that was interesting was the distance, and I don't, this might feel different in Australia in terms of the distance from feeling on the front line of some of these climate issues, but whether this is a future issue or a now issue, because there were, in this writing their letter from the future, some people commented on, they were using stock footage of actual natural disasters unfolding somewhere in the world, painting this picture of what's supposed to happen in 30 years time. Yeah. So it is that kind of sense of distance and closeness and compartmentalization. And there's definitely some cognitive dissonance happening there if you kind of try to break through.
Thank you. Fascinating.
I know we're sort of heading towards the end of time, but is it all right if I ask a question,
Yeah,
Jackson?
yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, Bill. Thank you so much. It was really interesting. Towards the start, you were talking about the question of space between disengagement and despair, and how do you hold on to that space? And one of the things that you mentioned there was hope. And I'm just wondering if you could perhaps expand on that a little bit. But I was also interested in how did you find the teachers in regards to, did they have the language and vocabulary to discuss that and, have that space to, unpack their thinking around it?
That's a great question. Yeah. And I think on hope, I mean, the one, again, I mentioned a lot Maria Oyala's work, but in particular, this concept of constructive hope versus kind of hope based on denial. So I think that idea of, and sometimes it's called active hope. So Joanna Macy writes about active hope. And it's the fact that hope is a process to be engaged in. It's like it's a muscle to exercise. It invites you in to be part of shaping that future. So I think that's the framing of hope I really like, because I think hope is kind of used in kind of a general way. The Obama campaign slogan that was then parodied by Sarah Palin as that hopey changey thing. So it's like, it's out there, but I think there's a very specific idea of what hope can be and what it can mean, and how that can be used, again, by educators or this is a subject of research. Then for the teachers, what I found, so again, with this kind of 12 schools I was engaging with, the first step was to find that super motivated teacher in each school who was carrying this stuff, who cared about it, who was convening young people. And in part that was through, there's a network in the UK, the UK School Sustainability Network, grew out of the London Schools Eco Network. And that was all climate strikers in secondary schools who felt like they had kind of gotten as far as they could go in their respective schools and then started networking across schools. And it was the same with the teachers. The teachers were like, had gotten as far as they could go. They really cared. They really wanted to support these young people. They're doing the best they could. And then they found this network of other teachers. So I think through those networks of the motivated teachers, you find this level of conversation that's very holistic. It's very systems thinking. It's very kind of emotionally aware. The flip side of that is that often these are teachers who it's not their job description. Sometimes it's not even their subject. It's like the person who started this UK School Sustainability Network is the Russian language teacher, but she was the one person who cared the most in her school about sustainability. And it wasn't part of her job description. And then she took it on and did a lot of work and was getting burned out by it. So kind of schools being able to formalize having an eco lead, sustainability lead, put budget behind it, put kind of job description behind it, I think can institutionally support it and elevate it. But that can't be imposed on someone who doesn't care already, because then it's like one more thing they have to worry about, like safeguarding or well-being or whatever. So it's anyhow, that's what I found is that there is this emerging network. And again, I don't know much about kind of in Australia if there's a kind of parallel thing that happened kind of post climate strikes, Fridays for Future, but there's something new happening now in that space. At least in the UK, it was a really quiet decade for sustainability education for about 2010 to 2019. And then now it's like lots of really interesting things emerging.
Just as a shameless plug, the centre that I'm responsible for has been tracking data on Twitter linked to age and doing network maps of young people's horizontal and vertical links to climate strike in that time period you're talking about. We're going to publish that next year, but it's a really interesting research, and I think we'd have overlap, so we must stay in touch, Bill.
Yeah, sounds great.
We have time for one more. If somebody wants to ask another question, comment.
I'll ask a quick one. Thanks very much, Bill. I was just wondering, did you get any feedback from parents?
So through, again, the interviews I did in schools, I talked to parents. It wasn't part of the questionnaire or the digital storytelling project, but I did raise some of these questions around kind of sources of environmental awareness for their children, and when it was coming from school or from home or from media or social media, and then also kind of anxiety and distress. And there were some parents who were tuned into that, but I think it wasn't actually as live an issue as I thought it might be, for at least from the parent perspective. So yeah, it's an interesting thing too, where this, I feel like, and there's a recent study through CAST, a research project in the UK, which is also connected to climate outreach, where they found actually relatively low levels of climate anxiety among different age groups, slightly more from young people than older people. But so I don't know, it feels like it's something, depending on who you're talking to, it's this really live, really like shaping their outlook thing, or it might not be. And I don't know, again, if the parents were just not talking about that in the home in some cases, or in other cases, they were really kind of more actively engaged with questions of kind of, again, climate in the future and the emotional response.
Did they see the digital stories?
So the digital stories we did a little bit of sharing of that through some of the schools. I haven't actually had a chance to talk to some parents involved in that, so that actually would be an interesting follow-up. Again, that was through the network. This UK School Sustainability Network was one of the main sources for the young people who participated in that, and they shared that through an exhibit, and actually we're at COP26 sharing it. So I think some of their parents might have seen it, but I never actually had any interaction with the parents afterwards.
Thanks.
Alan, you want to close it?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Bill, for contributing to this series. And I think we've got the next three people already for the next series. We should have Maria Ayala come and talk. I think we can arrange that. Martha Monroe, who's obviously done a lot of research overviewing this, and Blanche Furley is one of the people in Australia who's looked at climate strikes. So we've got potentially three for the next series already. But again, I really want to thank you, Bill, for contributing today. And if we can just follow up with perhaps how we can share some of the material from today. There's lots of questions in the chat just saying how interesting this is. There's obviously the papers, but the video resources and like, if we can follow up with you, that would be great. And thank you again to Jason for hosting.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, I think Mark already found some of the links to your videos, but if you could share that, and if I assume they're available, that would be great, because yeah, people are saying here that there could be a very good pedagogical resource for us also.
Yeah, great. That'd be great to share them. So yeah, great. And thanks so much for this opportunity. It's been great to connect with you all. So yeah.